Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Michael Hart. Welcome to Political Science 208, Survey of State and Local Government. This is going to be our first lecture, and in it, I will tell you what government is and why it exists. So, what is government? Why does it exist? And why do we study it? Now, government can be defined as a set of formal and informal arrangements used to organize a human society. Formal arrangements refers to formalized, usually legal arrangements in the form of laws, directives, executive orders, or anything else that has the force of law. Informal arrangements are social or cultural norms that shape a human society. To say that there is a set of arrangements is to say that there are many of them, or that they're systematically, that is to say, more or less rationally put together. Now, that's a definition of government. What we want to know next is why have government at all? Why does it exist? Well, because it is a very practical arrangement that humans have devised for themselves. Since prehistorical times, people have had government. Its practical uses typically involve securing things that people need to survive, such as physical protection, access to food and water, availability of shelter. Sometimes it appears that some human societies do not have government, but on closer examination it becomes clear that they do. For example, when a central government in a given country collapses, for example, in the past, in countries like Somalia or Afghanistan, and people would say, well, government has collapsed in Mogadishu, Somalia, or in Kabul, in Afghanistan. Well, what this actually means is that the central government has collapsed and can no longer exercise its power. However, tribal governments have stepped in to replace it. Perhaps tribal governments have operated for the longest time in their own geographical zones of control and have for the longest time had really almost unchallenged power, and the central government could not reach them. So to say that a country doesn't have government or a society doesn't have government is typically to just misunderstand the situation on the ground. Human beings seem to need government, or put it another way, government seems to be necessary for human beings. Now, there are different levels of government. Why are there different levels? Now, the first answer is simple division of responsibility, which allows different levels of government to specialize in different functions and thus to ensure better functionality, better delivery of service. For example, in a country like the United States, the national government is responsible for national defense. And that's written in the Constitution. You can find it near the end of Article 4 of the Constitution of the United States. But the national government cannot set up a secondary system of public education. It is state governments that are entrusted with that task. In addition to division of responsibility, what you also want to have is division of power. And division of power between different levels of government is part of a broader system of checks and balances. And the system of checks and balances attempts to prevent tyranny over the people. So the way it works is that if you entrust different levels of government with different responsibilities and make sure that they stay within their bounds, it becomes much harder for any level of government. And typically here we would be concerned about the national government because it is, in most countries, in possession of military resources and a greater amount of financial resources than state and local governments. It's the national government that we are typically most worried about when it comes to tyranny. And division of responsibility makes it harder for that tyranny to come about. So there are also different governmental structures. Now, why are there different government or governmental structures? Well, because of historical developments. Some historical circumstances led some countries to develop a system of government where they became unitary countries and some became federal, and I will explain in a minute what that means. And there are also geographical circumstances that lead different countries to develop different structures of government. Larger countries find it more practical to delegate more power and legal authority to levels of government below the central government, whereas countries that are geographically strong because of their geographical compactness and typically a smaller degree of diversity, they have different, typically unitary governmental structure. So, unitary versus federal versus confederate structure. In a unitary system of government, all governments below the national level of government are local. What does this mean? To say that a government is local is to say that legally it exists only by the grace of a higher level of government. So, in a unitary country like Italy or like Great Britain, the national government really, from the legal point of view, controls the very existence of all other levels of government. And for legal purposes, it can abolish them, it can create them, it can fuse multiple jurisdictions of lower levels of government into one, or it can break up a single government into multiple governments. In a federal system, like you find in the United States or Canada or India, you will see that there exists an intermediate level of government between the national and local levels. And in the United States, that level of government is called the state level. The United States has 50, as of this recording, it has 50 states. And in Canada, this intermediate level of government is called the provincial level. Canada calls it its intermediate governments provinces. In Australia, they're called territory. In India, they're called states. So different names for the same idea. So in a federal system, this intermediate level of government has an independent legal right to exist. And you would turn, in the context of the United States, you would turn to Article 4 of the Constitution, where you will find explicit protections for this intermediate or state level of government, whereby the Constitution makes it very clear that without the consent of the states, the national government cannot simply break them up and cannot merge several different states into one. Now, in the Confederate system, what you find is that it looks very similar to a federal system, with the twist that in the Confederate system, really the national government is a creature of state governments, and state governments tend to have supremacy, tend to have more legal and practical power than does the national level of government. A good example of a Confederate system is the first government of the United States, which was formally established in 1781 based on the Articles of Confederation written in 1777. It took 4 years to actually officially approve or ratify the Articles of Confederation, and they became, for practical purposes, the first Constitution of the United States. And of course, what happened very quickly was that people discovered that the national government was weak. It could ask for things like soldiers and money from the states, but it couldn't force the states to contribute either. And so weakness of the central government show the limit of this Confederate arrangements. Therefore, in the modern world, almost all countries are unitary or federal, and the Confederate arrangement, strictly speaking, doesn't really work.